What if the most dangerous man in World War II wasn't the enemy, but the general America couldn't control, couldn't silence, and couldn't afford to lose? In the spring of 1944, as the Allied forces prepared for the greatest military invasion in human history, a quiet but furious tension was building behind closed doors. Not on the beaches of Normandy, not in the bunkers of Berlin, but in the offices of men who wore stars on their shoulders and carried the weight of civilization on their backs. George S. Patton, the hard-driving, pistol-wearing, poetry-writing general from San Gabriel, California, had already become something that no military hierarchy could easily manage, a legend. And legends, as history has proven time and again, do not obey chains of command. They obey only destiny. If this kind of story, the kind they never fully teach in school, moves something in you, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who loves real history. And drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know before watching. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Dwight D. Eisenhower knew Patton better than almost anyone. They had served together, argued together, and respected each other with a complicated, charged respect that only men of enormous ambition can share. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces on December 24, 1943, was a man of extraordinary political balance, calm where Patton was volcanic, diplomatic where Patton was abrasive, strategic where Patton was instinctive. But by early 1944, Eisenhower had begun to see something that unsettled him deeply. Patton was no longer just a general under his command. Patton had become, in the eyes of the soldiers, the press, and even the enemy, something that transcended rank and regulation. The Germans feared him above all other Allied commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's own intelligence reports named Patton as the most dangerous Allied general on the Western Front. When a man's reputation begins to cast a shadow larger than the institution he serves, those who lead that institution face an impossible choice. It was not a single moment, but a slow accumulation of incidents that forced Eisenhower to confront this reality. The Sicily campaign of the summer of 1943 had already shown the world what Patton could do when unleashed. His 7th Army had raced across the island in a blitz that stunned Allied planners and humiliated the Axis forces, capturing Palermo on July 22, 1943, and reaching Messina before the British forces under General Bernard Montgomery, a rivalry that would burn for the rest of the war. But Sicily also gave the world the slapping incidents. On August 3rd, and again on August 10th, 1943, Patton entered military field hospitals and struck 2 soldiers he accused of cowardice, men who were, in fact, suffering from severe combat stress and battle fatigue. When the story broke in November 1943, carried by journalist Drew Pearson across American radio waves, the public exploded in outrage. Eisenhower had already quietly reprimanded Patton and ordered him to apologize to the men, the hospital staff, and the divisions, but the political fallout was catastrophic, and Patton's career hung by the thinnest possible thread. Harry S. Truman was not yet president in those early months of 1944. He would not take the oath of office until April 12, 1945. Following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But Truman was a United States Senator from Missouri, a veteran of World War I, and a man who had developed a deeply personal and conflicted relationship with the question of military character and moral accountability. As chairman of the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, known widely as the Truman Committee, he had spent years examining waste, corruption, and misconduct in the American war machine. He understood, better than most, the difference between a warrior and a leader. And when the story of Patton's behavior in Sicily reached the Senate floors and the American living rooms, Truman's reaction was both visceral and measured. He did not call for Patton's destruction, but he made clear, in the language of a man who believed deeply in the dignity of the common soldier, that no amount of battlefield brilliance could justify the humiliation of a man in a hospital bed. Eisenhower, caught between the military necessity of Patton and the political firestorm surrounding him, made one of the most calculated decisions of the entire war. He kept Patton, but he used that very notoriety as a weapon. Beginning in January 1944, Patton was assigned to command the fictional 1st United States Army Group, known as FUSAG, stationed in southeast England near the town of Dover. The operation was called Fortitude, and it was one of the greatest deceptions in military history. The Germans, who had come to believe that wherever Patton went, the real blow would fall, became convinced that the main Allied invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Hitler himself was so certain of Patton's central role that even after June 6, 1944, when Allied forces began pouring onto the beaches of Normandy, German High Command held back the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais for weeks, waiting for Patton's Phantom Army that would never come. In that extraordinary paradox, Patton saved thousands of lives not by fighting, but by being feared. And yet, the tension between Eisenhower and Patton did not ease. It deepened. Because the more the deception succeeded, the more Eisenhower saw something he could no longer ignore. Patton had become, in the minds of the public and the enemy alike, something that no single general should ever be: irreplaceable. And irreplaceability, in the world of military command, is another word for danger. A general who cannot be removed without consequence is a general who has already exceeded his authority, even if he has never broken a single order. It was in this period that Eisenhower began to confide in his closest advisors, including General Omar Bradley, that managing Patton had become one of the most exhausting dimensions of his command. Bradley, who had served under Patton in Sicily and would eventually command him in France, understood both men with painful clarity. He wrote later that Eisenhower bore the burden of Patton's genius the way a man carries a fire, grateful for the warmth, terrified of the burn. This is the exact midpoint of one of history's most extraordinary stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. Like this video, share it with a friend who loves real history, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most. Every comment, every share, every subscription makes it possible to keep bringing these untold stories to light. By the summer of 1944, Patton was finally unleashed in France. On August 1, 1944, he took command of the Third Army, and what followed was a military campaign of almost supernatural speed and ferocity. Within weeks, his armored columns had swept across France in a drive that covered more ground faster than almost any army in modern military history. He crossed the Seine, liberated vast swaths of French territory, and pushed toward Germany with a momentum that left his own supply lines struggling to keep up. It was during this campaign that Patton famously demanded more fuel, outrunning not just the Germans, but the entire Allied logistical system. His famous quote to General Bradley on August 29, 1944, captures the man entirely. He told Bradley that if he could get gasoline, he could be in Germany in 2 days. Bradley had to tell him the fuel was being diverted to support Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Montgomery's airborne gamble in the Netherlands, a decision Patton privately considered one of the great strategic blunders of the war, a view that many historians would come to share. Through all of this, Harry Truman watched from Washington with the complex gaze of a man who admired results but distrusted recklessness. When Truman became president in April 1945, one of the most immediate crises he inherited was not military but political: what to do with the generals who had won the war, but who now threatened to become larger than the democracy they served. Patton, in the final months of the European War, had begun making statements that alarmed both the State Department and the Truman White House. In September 1945, Patton made remarks suggesting that former Nazi officials could be useful administrators in post-war Germany, comparing the differences between Nazis and non-Nazis to the differences between Republicans and Democrats in America. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Eisenhower, now commanding the occupation of Europe, summoned Patton to his headquarters in Frankfurt on September 28, 1945, and relieved him of command of the Third Army, the army Patton had built, led, and loved above all things. Truman's reaction to Patton's removal was telling. He did not celebrate it. He did not mourn it. He understood it as a necessary act, the kind of painful, inevitable reckoning that comes when a man of war cannot make the transition to a world of peace. Truman himself had served as an artillery captain in France during World War I, commanding Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery near the Meuse-Argonne front in the fall of 1918. He knew what war did to men. He knew how it could calcify certain instincts and blind men to the requirements of a different kind of moment. What Truman said, in private conversations recounted by aides and later documented in historical records, was something that cut to the heart of the entire Patton phenomenon. That Patton was a magnificent instrument of war, but that an instrument, no matter how fine, must be set down when the music is over. It was not cruelty. It was clarity, the clarity of a man who understood that democracies survive not because of their greatest warriors, but because those warriors ultimately submit to civilian authority. George S. Patton never saw the final reckoning of the peace he had helped to win. On December 9, 1945, he was critically injured in an automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany, when his staff car collided with an army truck on a quiet road. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, at the age of 60, in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. He never returned to American soil. He was buried, at his own request, among the soldiers of a Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge, at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham. The man who had been too large for any single battlefield chose, in the end, to rest among the men who had followed him into the fire. Eisenhower, who had spent years managing the impossible force of Patton's personality, stood at the edge of history and said what no military report could fully capture: that Patton was the most brilliant commander of an army in the open field that our or any other service has produced. And Truman, the plain-spoken man from Independence, Missouri, who had watched it all from the distance of political reality, understood perhaps more quietly, but no less profoundly, that what America had witnessed in Patton was the eternal tension at the heart of free societies, between the individual genius that saves them and the institutional order that sustains them. History does not give us easy men to remember. It gives us complicated ones. Men like Patton, who carried poetry in his soul and fury in his fists. Men like Eisenhower, who carried the impossible weight of balancing brilliance against order. And men like Truman, who understood that the hardest decisions are not made on battlefields, but in the quiet rooms where the future is decided. If this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about, something you did not know before, then do something that costs you nothing but means everything. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear a real story about real men and what they were truly made of. Leave a comment below telling us what moment, what detail, what truth in this story stayed with you. Because history is not dead. It breathes in the stories we refuse to forget and the people who choose to keep telling them.